The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became truth. The name George Orwell is now synonymous with free expression, opposing totalitarianism, and some of the starkest warnings in literary history. But his fame and success has meant that his myth often eclipses who he actually was and what he actually believed in. So today, we're going to take a look at his fiction and also his much less well-known essays to see exactly why George Orwell was so worried about the future of civilization, as well as what can be done to prevent catastrophe and how we can be fooled into giving away our most fundamental freedoms. It promises to be quite an unsettling video, but also perhaps the most important one I will ever make. And let's begin by examining what Orwell is perhaps best known for, his critique of how governments and other powerful organizations can control the very ideas we can hear. But before we move on, if you're worried about information control on your newsfeed, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on Trump releasing classified documents on the JFK assassination. Whereas left-wing news outlets talked about government transparency, right-wing sources emphasized that this was in the public interest and also mentioned that intelligence agencies may not have wanted the files to be released. I especially like the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their own beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing Trump's new appointee in negotiations with Iran, and the right failing to cover a boycott by Democratic representatives in the Minnesota House. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So Ground News is fantastic for giving me an idea of the differences in reporting on different stories, so that I can get a variety of views rather than remaining tragically stuck in my echo chamber. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan, so please do use my link. But anyway, back to the video. 1. Information and control. One of George Orwell's most important experiences was working for the Indian BBC during World War II, producing loosely defined Allied propaganda. In itself, Orwell did not necessarily have a problem with this. He obviously wanted Hitler to lose the war, after all. But this also gave him a worrying insight into the way that governments and other large organizations can easily control what information people have access to by controlling those who disseminate it. Orwell found he was under the constant supervision and correction of the bureaucratic India office, and he later implied that he didn't feel he could speak at all honestly in his broadcasts. Above all, he felt that the broadcasts promoted a pro-imperial policy that clashed with his own sympathies for Indian independence. This experience would later inform his portrayal of Winston's dull and stifling job at the Ministry of Truth in 1984. I mention this chapter in Orwell's life because it taps into one of the key themes of his essays, a concern about the free access to information and the extent to which our understanding of the world is manipulated by those who have power. Reflecting on his time in the Spanish Civil War, he worries that no true account of the conflict will ever emerge. He predicts that General Franco and the Phalangists will now only promote their version of events, and with the increasing technological ability to falsify records, past evidence can not just be destroyed, but actually altered to reflect whatever narrative most benefits those in power. Or, as he put it in 1984, those who control the present control the past. To quote directly from one of his essays, "This kind of thing is frightening to me, because it often gives me the feeling that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world. After all, the chances are that those lies, or at any rate similar lies, will pass into history." This is classic Orwellian stuff, a dictatorial government falsifying history to suit its own aims. But this is not the only threat that Orwell saw to free expression. In many of his essays, he identifies corporate monopolies on publishing as the more immediate threat to the flow of information in Britain at that time. Although this is not a totalitarian control on ideas, it still imposes extreme limits not on what can be expressed, but what can be heard by a wide group of people. He notes that in order to be listened to, you need a platform, and it's pretty difficult to build one for yourself. Even I'm reliant on my benevolent overlords at YouTube HQ, and there are various topics that are much riskier to talk about because it may cause demonetization or even the channel getting penalized or deleted. But this was obviously much more extreme in Orwell's day, where in order to have any chance of getting your work in the public gaze, you would need to find a mainstream publisher to throw their resources behind your writing. But then you are beholden to the kinds of things that mainstream publishers would want you to say. For Orwell, who was himself a democratic socialist, he thought that these ideas were much harder to publish because why would someone who is wealthy enough to own a newspaper or a publishing company want to advocate for democratic socialism? In practice, Orwell says a lot of censorship is not enforced from above, but instead from within, because people are trying not to ruin their chances to make it as a writer or otherwise hurt their own economic prospects. Many people don't consider this kind of thing a threat to free expression today, but it's very much in line with classical liberal thinking like that of John Stuart Mill. In his work on liberty, he explicitly argues not just for no state censorship, but also actively encouraging a variety of ideas within a society. This is why he condemns punishment in the court of public opinion just as much as laws prohibiting expression. Orwell then extends the same critique to the monopolization of media. Of course, he doesn't think this is the same as totalitarian censorship, but it's still something he is very worried about. Orwell also identifies us, the people, as a potential threat to free expression. This is because we too are a powerful force that can be harnessed. In some of his letters, he notes that totalitarian governments cannot rise to power unless they have some base of popular support. A significant proportion of the population has to buy into their view that free expression is undesirable or too dangerous, or at the very least, they need to not oppose it too vigorously. Even more troublingly, he thinks people often support totalitarian movements out of a genuine wish to alleviate injustices, not realizing that they are sealing their own doom. This power of the crowd is represented in 1984 in The 2 Minutes Hate, where the emotions of the trampled citizens are always kept firmly on the government's enemies and never on the government itself. We also see it in Animal Farm, where the pig Napoleon harnesses the justified malcontent of the animals on the farm in order to seize power for his own nefarious ends. But it's worth noting, Orwell was just as concerned with people's apathy as with their potential antipathy. A surprising number of his essays touch upon the general lack of appetite for critical thinking or critical writing. He talks about how most writers just can't survive by penning carefully crafted analysis of current events or well-thought-out works of literature. They must spend a large amount of time doing hack work. This might be just insincerely repeating orthodox opinions for a paycheck, or it could be producing contentless rubbish for no good reason. Either way, this means there is far less quality information to go round compared to all of this more economically viable, but basically meaningless work. But this then has the knock-on effect that the informational pool is full of empty words, without much potential to encourage critical thought in a reader or in an audience. We also see this paralleled in 1984, where the government creates not just propaganda, but also endless empty entertainment and writing to fill people's heads with unthreatening, uncritical ideas, or just to stop them thinking at all. Ultimately, Orwell thinks all of these forces work in tandem to stifle free expression and critical thought. On the one hand, the press lords, film magnates, and bureaucrats ensure that only a few ideas are circulated to a wider audience, and on the other, the spirit of totalitarianism can sneak in, supported both by people who think that it will genuinely give them a better life, and also by the intellectual class, who Orwell sees as particularly susceptible to being convinced that liberty and free expression are just not good ideas. These restrictions can be as minor as social taboos or as major as legal declarations. But Orwell opposes both of them in pretty stringent terms. In his essay, The Prevention of Literature, he says, even a single taboo can have an all-round crippling effect upon the mind, because there is always the danger that any thought, may lead to the forbidden thought. I think this all helps to round out the popular conception of Orwell and his views. While he definitely did oppose totalitarian states, these were not the sole focus of his ire. He was severely critical of these other non-state-enforced manners of restricting expression as well. You obviously don't have to agree with him, but this recognition can give us a deeper appreciation of what Orwell was concerned about. It was not just state repression, but the monopolization of ideas more generally. But this is far from the only concern Orwell had about the way that we understand and process the world. He also examines what we do with information once it's in our hands. And there's no getting around it. He doesn't like what he sees. 2. Groups and Groupism. Have you ever had an argument with someone who just will not accept that there are flaws in their position? Whenever you bring up a perfectly reliable fact that contradicts their worldview, they will tie themselves in knots explaining why they don't have to listen to it. The fact is too inconvenient to recognize, so they have to find some way to dismiss it. Sometimes this comes in the form of simple denial, but they might also attack the person who said it as evil, or the fact itself as simply too outrageous to contemplate. Importantly, they might also dismiss it by labeling it as something the enemy says. Anything the enemy says is unthinkable, not because it's necessarily untrue, but because its truth would benefit the other side. This is a pretty extreme example, but Orwell thinks that most of us are prone to behaving like this in one way or another. He examines this tendency in detail in his essays on nationalism. He uses the term nationalism because of his historical context, but he's clear that this encompasses more than a simple bias towards one's own nation. He identifies it among communists and capitalists, amongst ivory tower intellectuals and the working class, and among all the major political parties. Today, we would probably call it group bias, and Orwell has a pretty neat definition. The habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. Of course, this is most clear when someone is explicit about it, when they are a card-carrying member of some organization that they openly identify with and whose fortunes are tied to their own. As Upton Sinclair once pointed out, it is incredibly difficult to convince someone of anything if their salary depends on them not being convinced. But Orwell argues that we are all prone to more minor forms of this fundamental group bias. He observes that if we identify with a group, either implicitly or explicitly, then a whole host of other things naturally follow from this. At one level, our group's enemies become our enemies, and the group's friends become our friends. It means that in all cases, the group is initially assumed to be in the right, and whoever is in conflict with them is assumed to be in the wrong. In a more severe form, this moral feeling may be resistant to any contrary evidence, but in more minor forms, it might just be that the standard of evidence for my group is in the wrong is placed an awful lot higher than the one for my group is in the right. If there is even a tiny scrap of evidence favourable to the moral cause of the group, then it is seized upon and treated as extremely reliable. But any evidence that paints the group in an unfavourable light is subjected to severe scrutiny. A kind of epistemic double standard emerges, where critical thought is all but abandoned when looking at one's own group, but suddenly a modern Socrates emerges when criticising enemy groups. This initial prejudice then cascades outwards to a whole heap of other cognitive mistakes. Orwell even prefigures the idea of confirmation bias when he explains how these groupists will decide on an answer based on their group's interests and then will deliberately seek out information that confirms that answer. This may not even be conscious, and they may think that it's just the right thing to do. After all, if you've already accepted that information contrary to your view is unreliable, compromised, and destructive, then looking for reliable sources and looking for sources that agree with me become basically synonymous. This means that a lot of groupists will be true believers. That is, they will not just think that certain information should be promoted because it is beneficial to them or their group, but they will claim that this is the God's honest truth, and they will believe it. In one absolutely cracking quote, Orwell comments on how thinkers are respected by groupists even when they are repeatedly wrong. Political or military commentators, like astrologers, can survive almost any mistake, because their more devoted followers do not look to them for an appraisal of the facts, but for the stimulation of nationalistic loyalties. Again, bear in mind that Orwell is using nationalistic in this broader sense that I've been calling groupist. Orwell is also clear that no matter how seemingly clever or astute we are all prone to this kind of groupist thinking. If you believe some modern moral psychologists, like Jonathan Haidt, for instance, then you might already be aware of this. Orwell particularly targets members of the intelligentsia, even those who normally display dazzling levels of critical thought, but who leave this skill at home when evaluating their own group or their own loyalties. In some ways, they are even more able to do this, since they can build a convincing case for their side much more easily, and then immunize that case from critique by selectively tapping into their critical abilities. Interestingly, Orwell observes that sometimes it is much easier to tap into this wholehearted groupism when you yourself are distant from the group in question. He points to British intellectuals who were extolling the glories of Stalinism. They were only able to dismiss evidence of totalitarianism or downplay its significance because they were not personally enmeshed in it. This separation from the physical reality of their beliefs sometimes allows the groupists to live almost entirely in a dream world, where utopias are always just over there, or hidden in the past, or in some alternative version of history where we somehow got things right. Of course, this is already pretty disastrous on the individual level. It puts the groupist out of touch with reality and much more likely to believe outright falsehoods. But it also poisons how we can have discussions. When a significant number of groupists become interested in an issue, that issue becomes almost impossible to scrutinize or settle. Most of the people gathering and compiling evidence for any particular position will have made up their minds at the start of their inquiry. It leaves us drowning in a sea of cherry-picked arguments and almost blatant disinformation. What could have been a struggle for truth then becomes a struggle for power, without either side necessarily being aware that this change has occurred. I would list the modern issues we could apply Orwell's observation to, but I think we'd probably be here for days. However, Orwell is not an idealist. He does not think that we can completely scrub this sort of bias from our minds. Rather, he thinks that being aware of our own groupist tendencies allow us to work against them. He suggests we consciously put epistemic guardrails in place. So when we encounter some information helpful to our group, we should subject it to more scrutiny than we initially think is appropriate. It's like an archer aiming above the target, knowing that the force of gravity will then pull the arrow down to the bullseye. Orwell even admits that some groupist sentiment might be necessary for emotionally engaged political effort. But to ensure that our groupism does not detach us from reality, we must be determined to both be aware of it and fight it. Orwell also thinks that most of us will be totally unwilling to do this, or unaware that the lesson even applies to us. But now, let's move from biases to stories. Because, as a writer, Orwell has an awful lot to say about how narrative can shape both our minds and, perhaps more importantly, our behavior. 3. Stories and their impact. It is tempting to split Orwell's work neatly into two parts. There are his novels or his poetry, and then his essays, his fiction, and his more straightforward argumentation. But he personally would probably not endorse such a definite separation. In fact, he often takes pains to emphasize just how important fiction and narrative are for how we approach the world, including how we form our fundamental values. For Orwell, although the control of information might dictate what facts we have access to, the control of stories can dictate how we sort those facts. He makes this point incredibly adeptly in one of his perhaps more obscure essays on magazines that are set in British public schools, which, for those of you who aren't from the UK, are actually the poshest private schools. It's all very confusing. In the early to mid-20th century, there were a lot of magazines with endless stories set in these posh schools, but marketed to people who could not afford to go. Orwell notes that in these magazines, a particular set of values was implicitly assumed. There was an emphasis on in-group spirit, a deep respect for the ultimate honour and authority of the school, and a quite rosy picture of what the upper strata of British society would actually like. Above all, he notes that the magazines had so many characters that everyone could relate to someone who was attending the school. implicitly encouraging people to identify with this upper strata. He thinks that stories like this form the patchwork of values and ideas that we just inherit from cultural context, but distilled into a rather repetitive narrative. It is a world of cheekiness but not violence, rebelliousness but no real change, and a gentle admiration of the richest and most powerful in the country. It's unsurprising that Orwell, as a democratic socialist, found this sort of thing faintly unsettling. He summarizes the situation, both in these magazines and in others like it aimed at different sects of British society, as follows. There is no suggestion anywhere that there can be anything wrong with the system as a system. There are only individual misfortunes which are generally due to somebody's wickedness and can, in any case, be put right in the last chapter. Now, whether you personally share Orwell's political leanings, the general point is a very valuable observation. These fictional narratives are so powerful because not only do they shape our values, but even what we think of as plausible. For Orwell, if we've been steeped in narratives that tell us that those in power are generally well-intentioned and that it is all very well questioning them, but we better fall in line when push comes to shove, this will make us less likely to think of future authority figures as potentially ill-intentioned or fundamentally flawed. It's perhaps no wonder that so many of his stories combat this particular narrative. In Animal Farm, the authority figures are consistently portrayed as duplicitous, scheming, and prone to grabbing more power whenever the opportunity arises. This is very much in line with Orwell's general skepticism of whoever has the most power. After all, to quote another great modern philosopher, with great power comes great responsibility. But Orwell is not just interested in external narratives like those found in stories. He wants us to pay careful attention to our internal narratives as well. Orwell doesn't systematically argue for this point like an analytic philosopher, but it is implicit in so many of his observations. For example, when he was fighting in the Spanish Civil War, he noticed he could not bring himself to shoot a phalangist when they were running across the battlefield with their trousers off. For whatever reason, that disrupted the inner narrative that allowed him to justify taking a human life. He needed the man to be an enemy soldier and only an enemy soldier. But when his more human complexities were revealed, it became that much harder to shoot him. The same situation happens in reverse when he witnessed someone's execution in Burma, or modern-day Myanmar. Before the hanging, there is a deep tension in the air, and Orwell feels supremely uneasy. He notes all of the little idiosyncrasies of the condemned man, particularly noting how he swerved to avoid a puddle, despite knowing that he would be dead in the next half an hour. But after the deed is done, the narrative quickly shifts. Someone mentions that the execution went smoothly, and much better than the botched ones in the past. And immediately the frame of the situation is changed. The comparison is no longer between the man who was alive and him now dead, but the whole event going smoothly and it going poorly. And as a result, things suddenly seem a whole lot better. With an alteration in the internal story being told, the reactions of the people there do a complete 180. I think this insight is one reason why Orwell's books are so often a skillful blend of political thought and narrative structure. They become almost inseparable. It would be impossible to write a version of 1984 where the political message of the book and the story are not very closely intertwined. And in exposing us to this external narrative, Orwell encourages us to shift our internal one. Orwell explicitly planned his work to do this, saying, "Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it." For Orwell, political battles are partly won in the minds of a people, and it is on that field that he sets his banner. My point is not that we must agree with Orwell's particular political stances, just that this link between narrative, behaviour and belief is well worth bearing in mind when we too approach the world. What are the stories that we tell ourselves, and where do they blind us to potentially quite severe critiques of our worldview? For that matter, where do they permit us to commit or permit behaviour that we would otherwise find abhorrent? It is not that we must abandon narrative. I'm not sure whether such a thing is even possible, but rather, like everything else, we might not want to let these narratives simply go unquestioned. But Orwell also knows that the correct narrative is also often unclear, either factually or morally. For instance, in his accounts of the Spanish Civil War, he notices the romantically tinged notion many people have of a war for liberation or a war to defend what's right. Many signing up had no idea of the reality of the conflicts, and this narrative put a glossy coat of paint onto an unbearable decision, whether to fight or whether to flee. Orwell wonders whether this is right, despite the fact that it is recruiting people for a cause that he thinks is undoubtedly right. On the one hand, he truly does believe in the Republican aim, but on the other, he slowly begins to see their actual efforts as hopeless. He reflects on what truly is the right thing to do here. Is the proper narrative that of a small group of people boldly standing up for a set of eternal principles against all the odds, or should this narrative eventually be abandoned so that the defeated Republicans might have a better chance of living to see another day? Orwell often combines this observation about narrative with the ones in the previous section to explain why it is people can have such seemingly contradictory, shifting, or absurd positions. When we analyze people's beliefs, we often think they're trying to make those beliefs consistent with one another and with the available evidence, the general idea of the truth. But if Orwell is right, then they are just as likely to aim for consistency with their identified groups and their pre-existing internal narratives. And, as Mark Twain put it, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? But Orwell's worries do not even stop there. Having already exposed how much of our politics and our belief systems are based on narrative coherence and in-group bias, he goes one step further and looks at how the very structure of language and thought begins to subtly control us, without us even realizing. 4. Language and thought. In early 20th century philosophy, some of the cleverest people in the world got very agitated about language and precision. Various thinkers became disillusioned with the way language was being used to put it bluntly, make nonsense seem plausible. Many of them even set out on intellectual quests to separate the wheat of rational, logical inquiry from the chaff of meaningless waffle. It's generally agreed that none of them found a foolproof system here, but their intuition speaks to a feeling many people have when reading certain texts or certain writers, that their use of language is covering up an insubstantial or otherwise fishy proposition. Orwell himself was deeply concerned about this, and it forms the subject of one of his most famous essays, Politics and the English Language. He begins by discussing needlessly obscure language which gives the impression of sounding far more authoritative than it is or has any right to be. For example, imagine that I am trying to express my dislike for a TV show. By itself, this doesn't sound that impressive. It's pretty normal for tastes in television to vary between people. But if I instead said something like, the story confuses the absolute spirit of art with the mediocre spirit of enjoyment, fooling Philistines into liking it, that sounds much more authoritative, despite meaning basically nothing. What on earth do I mean by the absolute spirit of art? It is a fancily made word salad which is ultimately all dressing and no food. It also implies that anyone who disagrees with this assessment is a Philistine and thus not worth listening to. A series of linguistic tricks have been employed to make a simple emotional reaction seem like it is reflective of some deeper truth. I'm not suggesting that no one can debate about art, but this statement by itself is pretty much contentless. Perhaps its biggest bluff is moving the frame of the discussion from me and my own perceptions to the TV show itself. This suggests that my reaction is more objective than it probably is, and so again puffs up the perceived authority at play. Orwell thinks these sorts of tricks are played all the time, and not always for malicious reasons. Sometimes it's just to fit in with a more general academic style. But Orwell also argues it does real damage to our political and our linguistic landscape. It means that discourse gradually becomes less and less understandable. At its worst, the overuse of complex language encourages people to just tune out of discussions, even when the outcome of those discussions is really important. Orwell characteristically homes in on politics here, saying that the monotonous drone of overly wrought political language means that both the speaker and the audience can just sort of switch off, which gently encourages disinterest and conformity. This sort of manipulation is even clearer when someone uses emotionally charged language to frame a discussion in a particular way without having to directly argue for that framing. I've used this example before, but if I was arguing for something completely abhorrent, like the mass killing of puppies, I would probably not openly say this. I would instead employ a series of euphemisms and metaphors to make the idea seem less evil. Rather than saying puppies, I would probably say canine predators, or even future biters if I was being really brazen about it. I wouldn't talk about harming puppies directly, but instead instituting whatever measures are needed to protect the innocent children of this country from these vicious, biting animals. The actual content of my policies may not have changed, but they sure feel different. Now it's not aggressive, but defensive. Not about sweet, innocent puppies, but scary-sounding canine predators. The prospect of killing all those puppies now becomes slightly more palatable, especially if this becomes the vocabulary you use when discussing or thinking about the issue. Orwell touches upon this same point when he says that language is sometimes used to defend the indefensible. This often means glossing over the violence involved in an action. So military engagements are described as pacifications. After all, who could be against pacification? It literally means making peace. We only need to think of all of the countries that have democratic in their name that are anything but democratic. And defending the indefensible is that bit easier if you combine all of these techniques, melding euphemisms and obscurantism in a fine blend of bullshit. Orwell uses the example of an English professor defending the Stalinist imprisonment of political dissidents. They might say something like this. While freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods. Here, we see the details of the atrocities obscured with the phrase features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, coupled with a minimization and the justification of the brutality as an inevitability. Not only is the statement borderline impenetrable, it is also lying by omission. And all of this is hidden behind a smokescreen of advanced language and labyrinthine sentence structure. Unsurprisingly, this is all mirrored in Orwell's fiction. Much has been made of Newspeak in 1984, where a new language is slowly created by the controlling party which aims to completely eradicate dissenting thought by eliminating dissenting language. The idea is that even if someone has a vague feeling that something is wrong, they will not be able to communicate this thought to anyone else or conceptualize it themselves in an organized way. Opposition becomes much more difficult when you cannot articulate what you're opposing. Thus, Orwell worries that all of these linguistic tricks may allow totalitarians to either rise to power or to consolidate it, since they're now able to downplay negatives or sow so much confusion that no one can tell what's going on. Again, Orwell is not positing an organized conspiracy, he just thinks the conditions are worryingly favorable to potential totalitarians. This clearly links with Orwell's concerns from the earlier sections. The fears about restrictions on expression, group bias, controlling narratives, and the alteration of language all form a multifaceted theory on the real, down-to-earth ways information can be used to control or influence people without us even necessarily noticing. And perhaps the scariest part is that they do not require some shadowy cabal or an already existent totalitarian state. They can each be found to greater or lesser degrees in almost every social group or society. Some of them may even be unavoidable. But if we know about them, we can approach this flow of information with our eyes open, rather than blindly walking into a nightmare. And on that note, there is one final message in almost all of Orwell's serious writing. Yes, it can get that bad. 5. Optimism and Totalitarianism. If there is a general tone to Orwell's essays, especially his later ones, it is deep frustration. It sometimes seems to him that most people are not taking the threat of totalitarianism nearly seriously enough, that there is an underlying sense it just cannot happen with them. Writing before and during the Second World War, He vents his annoyance at those who claimed Hitler was not that bad and suggested he should be left to rampage through Europe. After the war is over, he despairs at those in Britain who could defend the Gulag system in the USSR. Everywhere he looked, he felt that people were downplaying just how awful totalitarianism can get, or suggesting that it is impossible for it to come to their shores. For Orwell, people are only able to do this because they personally have not lived in a totalitarian situation or just looked at one without a distorting ideological lens. Orwell condemns this ignorance not just because it justifies horrors he thinks no one should be able to stomach, but also because it makes it that bit more likely that totalitarianism would come for their nation as well. Throughout his writings, Orwell emphasizes every unpleasant aspect of a totalitarian state, including ones most of us would not have thought of. He portrays children informing on their own parents, making themselves orphans for the betterment of the state. He shows the new leaders of a despotic government selling out their own people to enrich themselves and ensure their comfort. He creates worlds where the very notion of truth has been lost, not because there are no longer facts, but because those facts become impossible to establish. This is all to combat what he sees as the tempting lies of the wannabe authoritarian. He wants everyone to know that no matter what you are told, totalitarianism is as bad as you can think, and worse. In this way, Orwell is a real pessimist. He has a clear picture of what hell looks like and believes it is a real possibility that we will one day get there. This pessimism, this fear, is part of why, for many, his work is a canary in a coal mine. On the other hand, Orwell sometimes shows real notes of optimism. He is not a fatalist. He does not think that calamity is coming and that it is inevitable. In fact, this hopelessness is yet another thing he wants to combat. If we go straight from ignoring a threat to treating it as undefeatable, then there is no room for fighting back. Throughout his adventures, he met many who were willing to lay down their lives for what they believed in, and this gave him hope. But Orwell points out that the first step to any resistance is simple awareness. It is why so many of his essays are specifically about information. He seemed to think that if totalitarianism arrived in the Britain of his day, then most would not notice until it was far too late. This is what really comes across in Orwell's essays, that while despotism could arise from some military coup or an invasion, it could also be stumbled into out of ignorance or manipulation. In both 1984 and Animal Farm, the tyrannical regimes seize power because they make false promises to their societies, ones that they never even intend to keep. They deceive, cheat, lie, and obscure until people are just crying out for some scrap of certainty to restore their sanity. And the regime are all too eager to offer up their own narrative to fill the gap. Orwell did not necessarily think this was enacted by some shadowy, organized conspiracy, but can just as easily emerge bit by bit by repeatedly taking the path of least resistance and shuffling 1 inch closer to tyranny. When the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates was executed, it was said his ideas were corrupting the youth. When Galileo was imprisoned under house arrest, it was for expressing a heresy. When Stalin threw his critics into gulags, it was for counter-revolutionary activity. For Orwell, it all amounts to the same thing: the control of the people via the control of information. If Orwell is right, this is one of the most valuable lessons we will ever learn. And for anyone who opposes totalitarianism in whatever form it may arise, Orwell's essays are well worth a read. But if you want to look at his most famous work in much more detail, click here to watch my breakdown of his classic novel, 1984. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.